Good evening. My name is Selena Jaffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you for joining us for week 11 of our webcast series on COVID-19. This evening's webcast is on the topic of the impact of COVID on food security. The pandemic has severely disrupted agricultural, trade, and supply chains, and a recent analysis found that 130 million additional people, on top of the 135 million already experiencing malnutrition, will face hunger in 2020. The threats face hunger in 2020. The threats are closer to home as well, as students in the US face meal shortages, and a recent survey with mothers of young children found that nearly 1/5 say their children are not getting enough to eat. Our program tonight will discuss the many issues related to the growing crisis of food insecurity during this pandemic. Our speaker this evening is Caitlin Welch, Director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she provides insights and policy solutions to global food security challenges. She'll be joined in conversation by Lisa Helfman, Director of Public Affairs, Houston for H-E-B Grocery Company. Following the conversation, we'll be taking some questions. So please share your questions throughout the discussion via the Facebook and YouTube comment box. Thank you.
Good evening, Caitlin. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I should tell our audience that Caitlin and I have gotten to know each other in preparation for this, and we are kindred spirits in our passion for food and solving food insecurity issues across America. And I'm really honored to be able to have this discussion with you tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
So let's set the stage for our guests tonight. Can you give us a snapshot of what the food system and food insecurity challenges looked like before the coronavirus pandemic? And it would be great, as you talk about it, if you can define food insecurity for anyone who needs that as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. And I just want to say I fully reciprocate this. It's an honor to be talking to you. And thanks to the Asia Society for hosting us tonight. So I'll start by defining not food insecurity, but food security as the USDA defines it. And it's when households have enough access to enough food to meet their, to lead an active, healthy lifestyle. And it's for all members of the household. So not just several, but all members of a household. And prior to the pandemic, we weren't in a fantastic position in the United States to begin with. So before the pandemic, already 37 million people in our country were considered food insecure. And worldwide, it was a different picture. I'm happy to talk about that as well. But in our country, prior to the pandemic, there was already a large number of people food insecure.
What are some of the causes of food insecurity during, quote, normal times? Does it look different? Obviously, it looks different in the US than abroad. You were kind of hinting at that in the first part. And do we face these different challenges? But if you can paint that picture of the causes, that would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the United States, in quote unquote normal times, causes of food insecurity, I think are two things. One is that levels of food insecurity rise and fall with the growth and contraction of our economy. So for example, the number of people enrolled for SNAP and WIC benefits will increase during times of recession. And then also you have as we say, structural or systemic issues that aren't related to economic growth per se. So for example, among some communities, there's very limited access to healthy food. And that's economic access, of course, but also physical access. An example of this is in Washington, D.C., in the area called Anacostia, east of the Anacostia River, which is predominantly African-American. There are 3 full-service grocery stores for 150,000 residents of the city. Obviously, that's not nearly what that community needs to meet their food security needs. So that's a look at what it's like in the US in normal times. Around the world in normal times, food levels of food security and food insecurity often have to do with levels of production, agriculture production. And more recently, they also have to do with shocks related to climate change and conflict and other types of shocks.
So we weren't in the best position for underserved communities as it was. The food system wasn't perfectly set up for them. I've seen this through my work in the community with Brighter Bites and, trying to solve these issues there.
Mm-hmm.
But then the coronavirus pandemic hit and we hit a whole new level. We had a dramatic shift and it happened so fast. What happened? Like, what was the picture that got painted right as the coronavirus hit? I mean, I think it happened within a week or two. I don't even think it took that long. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on how quick the shift happened and what it looked like.
Yeah, I mean, it was immediate. And as I mentioned to you before, I started my job with CSIS in the middle of March, just as these effects were happening. And it was almost on a daily basis. The requests we were getting from media had to do with every day it was a different headline. So you're right, everything was happening incredibly quickly. And the way that I think about it is that people often conflate food security with the availability of food. That if there's enough food, then a country is food secure or a place is food secure. And if there's not enough food, then you're not food secure. And so what we saw in the United States proved that it's wrong to conflate those two things, because in the United States, we had enough food available. We had significant stocks of grains. Beef stocks were very healthy, fruits and vegetables as well. I'll say the same thing worldwide. But the United States, so our food security, the food insecurity crisis that started with the pandemic didn't have to do with production levels. And it had to do with many other things apart from that at different points in food systems, having to do with food processing, food distribution, access to food at market, et cetera.
And so digging deeper into those pressure points, like what those pain points are. So the pandemic hits, people they don't have the resources to go to their grocery store. An economic recession hits really fast. And then we hit all these pain points. And, what I witnessed firsthand was these incredible food lines, people waiting 3 hours for a box of produce. The food distribution system just couldn't keep up with getting food out. Did you see this? Have you been, has your research talked about that? And what were those pressure points of really meeting the needs of the underserved community?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of different pressure points, and sometimes those are related to each other. So one thing, for example, is we were seeing long lines of grocery stores. People thought with a lockdown that they had to shop for a month at a time. Which wasn't the case, but that behavior, coupled with the closure of public eating spaces, meant that people were buying a lot more at grocery stores. So you had long lines of grocery stores, and shelves were becoming empty for certain staple foods. So that was happening. Two things related to that. One is that that was one of the pressures that caused grocery store prices to increase. So it was just a side note. But as grocery store shelves started becoming empty, that meant that food banks were receiving less donations and excess product from grocery stores. So that's just a look at what was happening at grocery stores. Food banks.
Yes, I'm very aware, unfortunately. Like what you need for this week, we're not closing down. Leave some for your neighbor. In Texas, it was Texans helping Texas.
Yeah.
But no one had ever seen anything like this. So you can't help drive people can't help their emotions and their panic and their fear. But the cascading effect, which I know you're about to talk to, was
absolutely. Yeah. So one of them is the effect of that on the availability of food at food banks. And so that's one thing. That's a charitable food system. It's not government funded or anything, but as you and I were talking about, we saw across the board at food banks in the United States a 70% increase in demand. 40% of customers since the pandemic were people who had never gone to food banks before. And just to speak about our experience in Washington, D.C., the Capital Area Food Bank, which serves our region, purchased food from 100 semi-truckloads of food in the month of April to meet demands in the region. So 100 trucks. And that was 3 times as much as they had purchased for the entire year before then. So food banks were seeing huge spikes in demand, but also they couldn't rely on contributions to meet that demand.
And I'm guessing they didn't have the trucks to then distribute it out to get the product out fast enough. So both they couldn't get the product and then they couldn't get it out. Houston, I am on the board of the Houston Food Bank and grateful for their partnership both with the HEB and Brighter Bites. They are amazing because they're the largest food bank in the country and they can turn on a dime. But a smaller food bank like the Capital Area Food Bank, who's still large, I mean, there's some rural ones that it's even tougher. I know that they struggled with actual physical distribution. So not only not getting the normal donations, but even if they had increased financial means to purchase, then they couldn't get it out fast enough.
Sure, absolutely. With the drop off in volunteers, with the social distancing guidelines, for example. So a lot of that. And just to continue. So then in certain supply chains, so again, we didn't see necessarily a decrease in product available, but you saw a drop off in capacity to produce product. And also drop off in markets for products. So I think it's interesting to look at the meat supply chain. So orders, as you know, as some people are saying, fell off a cliff when restaurants closed, but not only restaurants, universities, so cafeterias, sports arenas. So orders from all of those public eating spaces fell off a cliff. So then people who are raising animals to, you know, for protein had no market for their product, but they also couldn't send it to be processed because, as you well know, especially in Texas, because of high rates of COVID among people working in meat plants. So that's another thing that we saw, again, not having to do with the availability of food, but other parts. So in this case, it was food processing.
So would you describe the system as fragile? Or there inefficiencies or things that this exposed through the pandemic?
Yeah. You know, I think that the best way that I've heard this described is that the food system in the United States, as we've developed it over the past several decades, is highly efficient, but it's not flexible. And so what we saw was, particularly with markets falling off from the closures of restaurants and other places, growers of food suddenly had far more food available than they expected to have, but weren't able to pivot to package food for grocery stores, to process food in different ways. So, for example, you might have a meat processor that was prepared to produce a prime cut of beef for a certain type of restaurant. But when that restaurant was no longer purchasing, there was no ability to adapt and, let's say, grind the beef and sell ground beef instead. And so we saw huge amounts of food loss across the country. And having a very efficient food system can be good because it can decrease the cost of food for people across the country. So it's certainly not a bad thing. But again, in the United States, I think that it came at the cost of flexibility. And I really hope that post-pandemic we'll look at ways to make the system more flexible.
And I'm going to hold you to that and ask you to talk to that in just a little bit. So we've had this opportunity to look at these issues, and we've realized that we're not so perfect at getting food out in our distribution channels and having flexibility. So I kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I just anecdotally to some of the requests that we were getting at CSIS from media were from foreign press asking us to explain, what are we seeing? We never imagined that such long lines at food banks were possible in your country. So explain to us what's happening.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I know Houston has experienced this, other places around the country as well. Food banks have been getting a lot of attention, certainly because of the image, because we can see, and we're shocked by what we're seeing on television. But the reality is that those food banks should be stopgap measures, and even food bank leaders say that this shouldn't be the system on which food insecure people rely to meet their needs. It should be something that they go to fill gaps. And it's our social safety net systems, it's SNAP and WIC benefits that feed far more people. So for every one meal provided by a food bank, SNAP benefits provide 9 meals. And I think that you've seen a lot of people do a fantastic job of donating money to Feeding America, for example, and also their local food banks and food pantries. that's something that's pretty easy to get behind. When it comes to SNAP and WIC benefits, though, there was a point in our not too distant past when there was bipartisan consensus on the how smart it was to invest in SNAP and WIC benefits. We're not in such a time right now. It's very partisan battle. So that's why I think that that people are steering clear of that and instead donating to food banks.
So was it partisan before? I mean, I kind of am loading this question because I know the answer, but was it partisan before the pandemic hit? Just to kind of level set what SNAP, can you level set what SNAP and WIC are and what the differences is, just in case our audience doesn't know?
Sure. Yeah, I think that even immediately before the pandemic, I think that it was still, the discussions were partisan, but SNAP is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be known as food stamps, but that's the formal name of the program. WIC is the SNAP for women, infants, and children, and they provide slightly different types of benefits, but essentially they are our social safety net system to help food insecure people access food.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and before the pandemic, SNAP benefits per person for people who are receiving SNAP benefits, it's not an exorbitant amount. It was about $120 per person per month. That's February, right before the pandemic hit.
I know a lot of food bank presidents have gone out and tried to show what it's like to live on the SNAP benefits, to show that it's really not a lot of money for a family to feed their children and live
Absolutely.
off
I've seen chefs try to do the same thing too.
Right.
Yeah.
So Brighter Bites, when the pandemic hit, did something really unique we started with HEB in Houston and Dallas, and we did Winn-Dixie in the Florida market, Walmart in the 99-cent stores, and a couple other markets that we're in. And we created grocery store vouchers for produce. And so they were $25 vouchers sent 4 times to our families in our communities, because Brighter Bites distributed produce through the schools. The schools shut down. We didn't want them to go out without healthy food, knowing this is the most important time to build your immunity. How do we get this out there? So normally coupons or vouchers are redeemed at like 30 to 40%. These vouchers initially have come back and have been redeemed at 70%.
Wow.
And I
twice the rate.
Right. And I thought that was very indicative of what the need is, and really showed. We have a stat in Brighter Bites, and checking with our families, that there was a 22% increase in food insecurity just since the pandemic hit. Wow. And this is a very hard hit community to begin with. It went from 72% to 94% of feeling food insecure, not thinking they could feed their family for the next meal. Yeah. So it seems to me, and of course, I don't want to come across bias because I work for a grocery store, but I've been examining this issue. And it seems to me that these lines at food banks are highly inefficient. I don't know that there's a better way to get the product out, and people are coming and they're not stopping, and the need is so great. To what you were saying earlier, 40% of the people coming weren't even had never been to a food bank before, right?
Yeah.
But it's just, there's got to be a better way to get food into people's hands and get them into the most efficient food sources there are.
Yeah, absolutely. And another benefit of relying on SNAP and WIC benefits is that the money stays in the economy. So it's not simply the food is given, it's that it's purchased, and that money goes to a grocery store, which can then keep its employees employed. It can keep purchasing product from producers, et cetera. So the economic benefits of SNAP and WIC are also greater.
So kind of teeing off of that, what do you think, do we all have a part to play in this? What the roles of versus the government versus NGO nonprofits and private citizens? Do we all have independent roles that we can play or should be playing? Or does it more squarely in a time like this fall to the government? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly think that the government has a really strong role to play. And I don't think that, in my opinion, the federal government hasn't stepped up the way that I would expect them to. So for example, right now we're seeing an unprecedented economic downturn, but also unprecedented rates of food insecurity. So as Selena mentioned at the beginning, you have almost 20% of households with mothers with age 12 and under, and almost 20% of those households, it's the children who are food insecure. And that's led research. This is a relatively new study that came out, and it's led researchers to say that young people are experiencing food insecurity to an extent unprecedented in modern times. And I simply haven't heard that amplified by our federal government. There have been increases in SNAP and WIC benefits in some of the stimulus packages. And I think that those are appreciated across the board. But what I see advocates saying is that those are, number one, they're not big enough. And number two, they're not for a long enough time period to cover how long it's expecting us to, for the economy to start to grow again. So I think that the government could play a stronger role, particularly in SNAP and WIC benefits. And then I think that we have such a strong charitable food assistance network across our country with food banks and food pantries that are doing a fantastic job, and you know that firsthand. And I think you really have seen citizens step up. So, for example, there's a story of a student at Stanford who, of course, was not in school this semester, and he saw the coincidence of huge amounts of food loss on farm when farmers didn't have markets, with so many people going hungry and long lines at food banks. And so he just simply started an organization that gathered donations and paid for transportation from farms to food banks. And so I think stories like that are really wonderful. So citizens do have a role to play and can do great things like that too.
And if you're not as smart or got as much time on your hand as the Stanford student, what can you do to help the system? I know that people have stepped up and run big financial campaigns for food banks, but are there other things that people can be doing right now to help?
Yeah. One thing that I think that people can do, and we were talking about this pretty early in the pandemic, and I haven't heard too much discussion about it, is be aware of the, just have a consciousness of the health of the people in the food system that especially ones that you're interacting with. So across our food system, so many people I consider them frontline workers, because they're there helping make sure that Americans have access to food and nutritious food during this pandemic, but they're often putting themselves at greater risk in order to do that. And so I think that when you're at a grocery store, just be cognizant of how much time you're spending talking to a cashier. If you are you wearing a face mask? Are you distancing yourself? Same thing with people who are delivering groceries or prepared food to your door. There are things that you can do to reduce that person's exposure. I think that's one thing. And also
I think that's tremendous. And I just want to laud you for saying that, of both having frontline grocery workers, Brighter Bites doing food distributions, as well as being on the board of the Houston Food Bank, just showing that respect. I don't know why that's become controversial. I'm just going to say that flat out, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but just doing those simple things, I think have such an impact. So thank you.
Yeah.
For bringing that up
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's pretty interesting for me, because I used to work solely on global food insecurity issues. And often in those cases, it's people who are the food producers who are themselves most food insecure. And I'm seeing a similar thing play out in the United States, where it's people who are part of the food industry who are at risk and who are becoming food insecure. So thank you. And something else that individuals, consumers can do, I think, is be aware of the amount of food waste in their own homes. So for as much food loss as we're seeing, and it's shocking what we're seeing, both in fruits and vegetables and also in the meat supply chain. I think that we've never seen this amount of food loss. In April alone, $5 billion worth of fruits and vegetables. And the CEO of Tyson says that millions of animals will have been euthanized through this pandemic. So it really is shocking. But I've been talking to some experts in food loss and waste who say it's a temporary anomaly and things will normalize. But the greater problem in our country is food waste. And particularly right now, when there are shortages at grocery stores, just making sure that whatever food we buy, that we use it, and we use all of it. So I think that's something that individual consumers can do right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just want to not ignore the other parts of the food system. I know we're talking about food security, but I know that we've had challenges in the entire food system, and I wanted to just touch on that because it seems like everybody's being affected. We've touched on this a little bit, but if you can kind of talk about it generally, or more specifically, I should say, of how the industries have been affected, and it's affected the grocery stores and demand and everything. You know, we've worked very hard at HEB. Our priority is keeping our prices low for customers, but I know that that hasn't been the case across the United States because different things have happened in the supply chain and changed pricing structures. And to your point, they haven't been able to process food. So kind of talk to me about the food system for people like you and me that can, fortunately, go to the grocery store and buy product, but you still might see some changes in the way that your stores look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did experience some shortages and things that I never thought that I would experience. So things like flour and yeast. It took weeks for those things to reappear on shelves. For eggs, we had to go one night. We had to go to 3 different grocery stores in order to find eggs.
Wow.
So yeah, so it's a reality for everybody. I think everyone in our country will have been affected by what's happening in the food system during this pandemic. But in terms of restaurants too, and we have chatted about that. But before the pandemic, people were spending half of the money they were spending on food was being spent outside the home, so at restaurants. That simply isn't happening anymore. In March and April, the restaurant industry experienced $80 billion in lost sales. And then restaurants are experiencing the worst job losses of any industry in the United States. So 6 million jobs lost in that industry.
It's unbelievable. We at HEB did a lot of partnerships with restaurants and started selling their food directly in our stores.
Yeah. And when people talk about how things might look different afterward, I think that that's a great example of it. I've heard about that happening in other places as well. But I think we'll certainly see some restaurant closures.
Okay, so you teed up my next question.
Okay.
I don't mean to be ignoring restaurant closures. I hope they don't happen. And I hope that people get back on their feet. But, you know, I know we're all looking forward to this being behind us. When that happens, nobody knows, even given spikes reoccurring already. But what, I know it's going to affect our behaviors. I know we're not going to just totally go back. I don't mean to be flippant, but I know that my cooking game has increased in my house. My kids say increased. Where was it before? They might not remember, but it was there before. But all kidding aside, like, what is the food system in the new normal? And, you know, what are ways that we can do things better to make it a food system that serves everyone at a more effective level?
Yeah. I think just to your point about our eating habits, I think that it might be the case that people eat at home more so than they're eating at restaurants. I've seen some literature, not even in the food industry, but just in kind of in pop culture about that. So I think that you might have higher rates of purchasing from grocery stores. People are realizing they're saving money and it's healthier for you, oftentimes. So that's one change that I think that we might see. I'm hoping that in supply chains, I'm hoping that we build in some options so that when markets evaporate, then there are contingency plans. So producers say, okay, well, this seller is no longer buying. So how can I pivot? What other markets might I look to? And I think that this is probably shocking people involved in food chains into realizing that we do need those contingency plans in place. And then some other ways that I think that the food system could be different are, I think that what's happening in our meat supply chain right now is just, it's so visible. I think that there have always been problems to different degrees in our meat processing system in the United States, but right now you have, I think 24,000 cases of positive cases of COVID-19 at meat processing plants. And 88 deaths. And that's not just in a few states, that's across 33 states. So it's nationwide. Yeah. Nationwide. And so I think that with that, I think that people are very aware of the toll that our food system takes on workers and the risks that workers put themselves in. And then of course there's all the animal loss. I mean, I think that's shocking to a lot of people as well, how many animals had to die because the system broke down. But just thinking about the meat supply chain as an example, I'm hoping that post-pandemic, we have far better safeguards in place for workers in that industry. And our country already consumes far more meat per capita than any other country in the world. So it could be the case that once we put these new safeguards in place, it could be the case that the price of meat increases. But I think that it would probably increase to the point that it needs to be to pay workers enough to give them health care, et cetera, et cetera.
I agree. We're starting to get questions from the audience, but I would love to ask you one more question. If you could wave a magic wand, what changes would you, Caitlin Welsh, make to the food system? You are one of the foremost experts in the country. Would they be policy changes, or you kind of touched the one on the meat industry that you would have safeguards in place? Are there other things that we can do to not have to face the same levels of food insecurity and grant more people food security? What can we do? Let's just start in the United States.
Sure. So I think that in the United States, I think that what I would do would be to make, do something. And I wish that it was just one wand that we could wave to do this, but
you can have two. I'm just kidding.
To make fruits and vegetables available to lower income communities wherever they are. The fact of the matter is that it's the food that's bad for you that's easiest to buy right now. And we see repercussions of that across the economy, the healthcare system, et cetera. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to give better access to healthy foods to more people in our country.
Okay, I just want to tell everyone in the audience who knows me and as the founder of Brighter Bites, I did not load that question for her. That was her saying it, that we share that passion. And I think it's evident just the shocking health disparities that have come from COVID and or has been daylighted by COVID, I should say. New York Times ran an article that said, besides age, the number one issue that health issue that determines if you survive COVID is obesity. And of course, that obesity, overweight, and obesity levels in lower income, underserved communities are much higher. And so that's why we saw this disparity in minority populations that is 100% preventable. Like not a little bit, but totally preventable. This is my passion point, clearly.
Yeah, you don't need a vaccine that doesn't exist yet. You just need to eat fruits and vegetables. And
right. So thank you for that. Okay, you may have a second magic wand, although that one was so good. I almost don't want to give you another one.
No,
but
I guess what I meant by that was that it's not just one thing you need to do. It's not just a matter of like putting better grocery stores in lower income communities. It would be a matter of course, raising incomes, improving public transportation, et cetera.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let us switch to the audience. The first question, I actually am going to start to answer before I toss it over to you. With the number of COVID cases going up around the country, should we expect another run to the grocery stores with items running out and there being a quota on each item? And I am going to say, as representative of a large grocery chain here in town, that is more up to you than the food supply system going down. We have food. At HEB, as you know, we never ran out of food. And really the only reason that it was not on the shelves is we couldn't keep up with the panic buying. And so I worked really hard with my team and the media to say, we're going to be here for you and there will be food on the shelves. We might not have every item you want. And to your point, there were times, I don't think we ever, I don't want to say that, ran out of eggs, but I don't want to say that. We did run out of items. Clearly we had empty shelves, but we had distribution going. So I think it's the public. And as you've said, we have food supply. There is food here. It's not that, it's getting it on the shelves from a distribution. Do you agree with that?
I do. And it wasn't simply the number of COVID cases that caused runs at grocery stores. It was the lockdown measures that we saw, which are being lifted across the country. So without recommendations to stay indoors, as we saw back in March and April, I think that people won't be afraid that they won't be able to access food at grocery stores. So I agree with what you said, Lisa.
Okay, great. Okay, should each country, this is more you than me, I'm not going to pretend to know foreign policy. Should each country try to address its own food and food security issues, or should there be a more international collaboration to address the issue globally?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It really is.
Yeah. And my answer is going to be that there needs to be coordination at an international level when the crisis is a global crisis. So as an example, the last time that the world experienced a major global food crisis was 2007 and 2008. That crisis had to do with lower production of food, so lower amounts of food on global markets, coupled with other things that were putting upward pressure on prices. One of those things was that a number of countries were putting bans on exports of food. So they saw there was less food on global markets. They wanted to reserve their food that they were producing for their domestic customers. So that was about 33 countries that put those export bans in place. And those just had detrimental effects across the board. We saw a spike in the number of food insecure people. It was the highest number in recorded history to that point. And then it really does take coordinated effort to explain to countries that you might think that export bans work, but really they're bad for the global markets and bad for your own domestic market. So I think if we rely on individual countries to fend for themselves, I think that's when you see actions like that. Luckily, in this crisis, we haven't had as many countries putting on export bans. Early on, we were afraid. We saw that number increasing almost daily. But as of now, it's not enough that it's really greatly concerning.
I don't mean to get off on a tangent, but what you said reminded me of something. I read an article out of the Philadelphia Inquirer today that said from that recession you talked about, it took 10 years to recover from the food security issues that were caused by that recession. And just a year or two before the pandemic hit, had we gotten to a point where levels had stabilized. I mean, stabilized is not where we want it to be, but we had gotten to a better place. I'm just wondering if it took 10 years to recover from that, are we in for a long road after the pandemic?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that,
or is that stat true? I mean, you can speak to it.
I think it depends domestically, if we're talking domestically versus globally, but I do think domestically, I think that it was the number of people enrolled in SNAP benefits, for example, had been declining since the 07 recession until 2017, then started to, or maybe until sometime recently, and then started to rise, and of course is spiking right now. Globally, what we saw was that we did make progress against we were reducing the number of food insecure people worldwide. For a long time, there were some spikes, but generally from 08 until 2018, it was declining. But then in 2018, it started to rise again for reasons related to conflict and climate change and other things.
Do you think that we're in for a long road ahead of us to recover from the pandemic?
I do. Does that question specify domestically or globally? I can talk about.
It's my question.
Oh.
Just on how long we think like the road is. And I know you don't have a major magic wand and you can't make predictions, but I'm guessing this isn't a 1-year problem, I guess is what I'm saying. Is it?
Yeah. I think that what we're seeing is that it's almost like we don't know what's going to come around the corner that might be affecting food systems in our own country. And I think I mentioned to you that I had given a talk in late March about food systems in our own country and how we were faring. And at that time, we were saying that the meat supply chain is very healthy. It should be unscathed through the pandemic. And of course, it took not much time before that was flipped on its head. And so we're seeing such a diversity of impacts on food systems in the United States. I think that it's going to take a long while to recover. I don't know how long it's going to take the restaurant industry, for example, to recover. I don't know how long it's going to take for us to give workers the right protections that they need. One thing to remember too is that for children who are food insecure, the effects of malnutrition right now, particularly in early childhood, for in the first 2 years of life, those effects last a lifetime. So in a sense, if they're extremely food insecure, they might never recover from those effects. So I think it will take a diversity of actions in order to help us to recover from this.
It makes me think that if it's that if it's a lifetime of effect, that we all do have a role to play to getting food out and to making sure that our neighbors have opportunities to stay food secure.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a few specific questions that maybe you can attack. Is crop insurance encouraging farmers to dump food like milk? For example, if the market price is less than the price floor, does insurance step in? Are they making a decision based on that rather than the supply chain?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I can't say for certain. One thing that's been strange about covering these issues right now is that the restrictions on travel prevent us from seeing these things with our own eyes a lot of times. So there are certain things that I'm able to observe myself, but things like dumping dairy products, for example, like I haven't been able to talk to farmers. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I will say though that that what we're seeing is sometimes media puts the blame on the farmers that are destroying their product, on the farmers that are plowing under their vegetables or dumping dairy or having to kill their animals. But that's the last thing that those farmers want to be doing. They're only doing that as an absolute last resort. So I think that that's it's on us to be sensitive to the fact that those farmers are not in a position they want to be if they're resorting to that as a last measure.
Right. I mean, they're just trying to survive, right? And be able to feed their families because it is such a sensitive industry. And I think that we think about big ag and some people might think that that's whether it might be glamorous that it's all these major I think that it's an industry that works really hard and really cares about what they're doing and really tries their best and is trying to feed. So the next question I think is purely opinion. It's talking about, I think that I'm reading it right, that it's how can the negative effects of raising meat be lessened on an individual basis other than reducing it in your diet? And I think that probably that on an individual basis, that's one thing that we can do. And it's not just a food issue, but a climate change issue and other things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think so I think for the sake of climate change, animal protein is one of the most the most carbon intensive food option out there, the most by many folds. So I think that it's better for a lot of reasons to reduce the amount of meat. On the other hand, it's one of the most bioavailable sources of protein. So I wouldn't advocate. I mean, I think that obviously personal choice if you like to cut it out. So totally no problem with that at all. But I do think advocating for better treatment for workers, and I think that letting the companies that run the meat industry in the United States, and it's just a small handful of companies, letting them know that you're aware of worker mistreatment and that it matters to you. I think that would matter to the companies.
Okay, you created the perfect segue to the next question from our audience. What are long-term policies we should be advocating for and supporting? So that might be number one in the meat industry and supporting workers. And do you have other ideas of things that might help?
Yeah, related to that, I'm seeing support for legislation right now that makes the supply of migrant labor consistent, be it by extending visas or having a path to naturalization for people who are working in our food industry. But our food system relies in large part on labor from other countries. And when you have things like lockdowns related to health crises threaten our labor market, that then threatens our food system. So I think that that having a predictable supply of labor for our food systems is one thing. Second thing is making sure that the people who are there to make sure that we have ample supplies of nutritious food have access to healthcare and other benefits. And it's pretty shocking when you read about the fact that these people who are picking our fruits and vegetables, packaging those things, sending them to grocery stores, they don't have access to days off for sick leave. So they might be sick when they're doing this.
Let me take it one step further. A lot of them don't even have access to the fruits and vegetables that they're picking. So Brighter Bites launched, we're in 6 cities across the country, and one of all major cities except one is Immokalee, Florida, where a lot of farming goes on for the United States, and a tremendous partner of Brighter Bites is Littman Family Farms. They're a massive tomato farm, and they came to us after hearing a presentation we did to the Produce Marketing Association, and they said, we have to bring you to our hometown because we want fruits and vegetables for our workers, that they don't have access to that today, and we want to change that.
Wow.
And they literally funded us to begin a program in Immokalee, which is, it's such an interesting dynamic. If anyone listening knows, Immokalee is one of the poorest communities in the United States, which is across the highway from Naples, Florida, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. And the disparities are amazing. And kudos to this farm that brought us in to change the dynamic of how people are receiving food in their community and really make that go away for them. So this is a real problem, that they can pick oranges, tomatoes, zucchinis all day long and not be receiving it in their house. And that's easily fixable. It was one company that was like, we want to change this, and we changed the whole community.
Yeah. Can I ask you, how did you do it? How did you?
Yeah. So, today we have a lot more partners in Florida, but we started Brighter Bites. And for anyone who doesn't know, Brighter Bites is a co-op concept. We go into the schools and we deliver produce, and we teach the families and the kids how to use it. And we make it fun, and we demystify produce, but we joke that we flood their houses with produce. We give them 25 servings, 25 pounds, about 50 servings a week for 16 weeks during the school year. And so we're really making produce part of the fabric of their lives. And so it was especially meaningful to go into these farm worker communities where produce should be a part of their lives, in my viewpoint and your viewpoint, and they just hadn't been able to gain access to it on a commercial basis. And so we were able then to do that and change their eating habits that we've done in all the other cities that we're in. And it was a really big success. And now not just the farm, Littman, but the community has gotten behind us, and it's been tremendous.
Yeah. Wow.
So, it's little, but it's these changes are possible.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows you what's possible.
Right. Okay. So getting back to a international question, will geopolitical relationships affect global supply chains in the future?
I can talk about how geopolitical relationships will affect global food security, including but not limited to supply chains. So at the time of the last crisis, which was 2007 to 2008, the number of people who were affected by that crisis was comparable to what we're seeing right now. You had 850 million people who are already food insecure, and then that crisis pushed about 40 million more people into food insecurity. Today, you have 820 million people who are chronically food insecure before the pandemic. World Food Program is estimating that because of the pandemic, we're going to have 265 million more people at risk of acute food insecurity. So we're not at a much better place than we were in 2007, 2008. But at that time, there was just much easier cooperation in multilateral fora like the G7 and like the G20. So the G7 came together. And in 2009, they pledged over $23 billion to improving global food security. It was the G7 plus some other countries jumped on board and said, we want to help too. And then the G20 took actions too. They created a system for making prices in ag markets transparent. They created a fund to help farmers in developing countries. So G7 and G20 took coordinated action to address these problems. Today, I think that the agendas of both of these, of the G7 and G20, are quite different. The agendas are different, but then relationships among countries are vastly different. Unfortunately, I do not expect the level of cooperation or action as I saw last time around. So that's unfortunate. Maybe some other mode of cooperation will step in and take its place. But again, the cooperation really did help last time around. Hopefully something will happen this time.
Hopefully, we'll cross our fingers. the next question is a phenomenal one. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but maybe we can go into more depth. What personal choices can people make in being responsible so that every family has enough food to feed themselves and their children? I think this tees off what you were talking about a minute ago, but I'll put it back in your court.
Yeah. I think it's a combination of actions that we can all take every day. And so, for example, one thing we were seeing early on, and I know that you were advocating for this in HEB, but it's don't buy more than you need. I think that a lot of people wanted to buy for a month because they're afraid for their family, but if everybody bought for more than a month, for a month, then there wouldn't be any food left. So that was one action people could take early on, which is just buy what you need and know that you'll be okay. I think right now, one thing that people can do is advocate for policy, for smart policies. So if you understand that SNAP and WIC benefits are far more effective at reducing food insecurity, then let your representative or let your senator know that. Or if you think that workers on the front lines should have better protections, then I think that let companies know that. And then also in terms of actions families can take, just be aware of the amount of food that you're using and be aware of the waste that you have and try to reduce that too. So things that on an individual level and also advocating for change on a bigger level.
Awesome. So the next question I'm going to take, and then I'll throw it to you if you have anything to add. And so it says, is donating food or money to the food bank more helpful? I'm going to say that food banks know their business and that they can buy product much cheaper than you can, and your dollar can stretch much farther by you donating money and letting them be effective with those funds versus sending tin cans their way that are hard for them to distribute when they're not buying mass amounts. So I think volunteering is amazing if there are opportunities and you feel safe. I think that can be as helpful as money. So don't think it has to be money, but I think going out and doing a can drive or bringing a little bit of food in is not as effective or efficient. So that would be my.
Yeah, fully agree. And that's what I've been hearing on a nationwide scale, but also I wanted to donate in my own hometown. I'm from the Great Lakes area. So I talked to someone who was involved in the food pantry there, and she said, far better to give money to the food pantry than to donate food. So, yeah. So
well, I think we have given everybody a great background of what's going on, as well as you have given phenomenal suggestions for calls to action. And I appreciate that. As someone passionate, I think you're very eloquent in the way that you were able to give us those opportunities. So thank you for that. It leaves us all with something that we can do. And I'm getting the notice that it's time to wrap up. When Caitlin and I were talking over the last week, we're like, oh my gosh, we could talk for days. And that's evident tonight that we scratched the surface, but I think it's been very informative. And I personally look forward to staying in touch with you and appreciate your time.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And again, I'm so glad that the Asian Society highlighted this issue.
Absolutely. So thank you for joining us this evening. Please tune in again next Thursday, June 18th at 7:30 p.m. Central Time, of course, for Asia Society's weekly COVID-19 webcast. I'll tell you, next topic is something that I think many people are curious about, and it's how universities are preparing for the age of coronavirus and beyond. I know we're hearing a lot of different things, so they have asked and he has agreed to speak. David Lebron, the president of Rice University, will address the decision-making process that colleges and universities are going through right now, what might be the short-term effects, as well as the long-term changes that we're seeing in universities as they adapt to the pandemic, how they might look this fall and thereafter. And so I know that's a topic that affects a lot of people. So I encourage you to tune in. You can learn more about their upcoming webcasts or anything else through the Asia Society website. And I just want to thank you for everybody tuning in. I think this was a phenomenal discussion and I'm honored to be a part of it. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy and has the respect for everyone in the community like Caitlin talked about. And let's all do our part in Texans helping Texans. So thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Good. Thank you.
Good night.